Yesterday, multiple sources reported that in Geneva, the US and China entered a new round of negotiations on trade and tariffs. However, the meeting that only lasted about 15 minutes when the atmosphere became. The US side unexpectedly presented a series of conditions and stated that if China met these demands, Washington would reconsider the tariff issue. Before even hearing all the demands, the Chinese delegation immediately stood up, left the meeting. However, just as the dialogue risked collapsing from the start, the US side quickly, suggesting that both sides discuss it. After a few minutes of discussion outside, the Chinese delegation decided to return. On May 10th, the US and Chinese delegations began trade negotiations in Geneva, following a series of retaliatory tariffs over the past few months. Leading the US side was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, while the Chinese side was led by Vice Premier. Around local noon, social media unexpectedly surfaced information that the Chinese delegation had abruptly. The account Whitegrass24, which specializes in posting unverified current news on social media, posted a photo of Mr. He stepping into a car with a caption, "Chinese Vice Premier He Lifon and the Chinese delegation walk out." Midway through the US-China trade dialogue in Geneva with US Treasury Secretary Scott, and the US delegation gave no reason for the sudden departure. However, in a comment right below, an account named journalist Chen Wei, head of China Daily's EU office, wrote that it was fake news. This is completely fake news. The dialogue is still continuing today. According to this journalist, the two delegations met for about then took a lunch break and had returned to continue negotiations. Chinese state media also confirmed that the economic between China and the US in Geneva continued after noon on May 10th. Earlier, US officials including Secretary Bessent and Xi Mission Korea smiled as they left the hotel to go to the meeting. Mr. Bessent declined to answer questions from reporters. Meanwhile, several cars with tinted windows left the hotel, where the Chinese delegation was staying on the shores of Lake Geneva. On May 9th, Swiss Minister of Economic Affairs, Education and Research, Mr. Guy Parmelin, affirmed that the US and China are likely to jointly de-escalate. During the negotiation process, he believed that a mutual suspension of tariffs during the talks is entirely possible, while noting that both sides can extend negotiations until May 12th if necessary. Currently, the US is imposing import tariffs of up to 145% on goods from, while China has also responded with 125% tariffs on US goods. Before the negotiations, US President Trump has suggested that an 80% tariff on Chinese was reasonable, while emphasizing that the final decision would depend on the Beijing Treasury Secretary. Information about the incident continues to be verified, but if true, this would be clear evidence that US-China trade relations are in a fragile, precarious state, where even a careless remark could jeopardize dialogue efforts and risk collapse. Previously, the Chinese side firmly stated that the government would not accept negotiations, while still under tariff pressure. They argued that since the US initiated a trade war, if Washington truly wants dialogue, it needs to cease pressure tactics and approach Beijing on an equal, mutually beneficial basis. China's tough stance shows their determination to protect their interests, so many people hope that this round of negotiations will proceed. According to the New York Times, the importance of these negotiations is very high, but expectations leading to a significant reduction in tariff. After many weeks, both sides finally agreed to sit down, and analysts predict that the content of this weekend's negotiation will mainly revolve around defining positions and methods for continuing negotiation. Therefore, Washington and Beijing's willingness to engage in dialogue has raised hopes that bilateral could be de-escalated and tariffs can be adjusted downward. The impact of current tariff levels has spread across the global economy, forcing supply chains to restructure and causing businesses to pass increased costs on the consumer. Economies and investors are closely following the trade negotiations amid concerns about a full-scale economic war between them. This confrontation could potentially slow global growth and drive up prices, especially for parties dependent on imports from China, which are on high alert,
as they must cope with new tariffs and the accompanying instability.
Although both sides have clear interests in reducing tensions,
a long-term truce remains distant.
Nevertheless, initiating high-level talks can be seen as a positive step, opening hope that both sides will avoid confrontational rhetoric and actions, at least in the short term. Notably, the US side has adjusted its negotiation lineup, with figures leaning toward a more dovish stance,
while avoiding the hawkish tones that often provoke.
This leads Washington to choose a more flexible strategy to seek substantive results. On China's side, although the full delegation composition has not been announced, if officials in charge of drug control are included, it shows Beijing is ready to discuss even issues the US considers non-trade, but which affect economic and social security.
In reality, the trade war has left clear marks.
Exports from China to the US have sharply declined, while many U.S. businesses have had to raise product prices, contrary to inflation control goals. Nevertheless, the U.S. side keeps many options open, even prepared for negotiations to fail. Japan is seen as creating long-term strategic advantage. Trade tensions now no longer revolve only around deficits or tariffs, but have expanded to sensitive areas like technology, economic security, and drug control. This makes the picture of economic relations between the two countries even more complex and unpredictable, especially as internal political factors and global strategy increasingly strongly influence the negotiations. On China's side, its government asserts it will not accept negotiations while still under tariff pressure.
They argue that the U.S. side initiated the trade war,
so if Washington truly wants dialogue, it needs to cease pressure actions and approach Beijing on an equal and mutually beneficial basis. Although the newly proposed tariff levels of around 80% are significantly higher than current, these figures are still enough to nearly paralyze trade flows between the two sides. Some analysts believe both can take concrete steps to create premises for the negotiation process. One notable move would be to return tariffs to around 20%, equivalent to the situation before the U.S. raised tariffs
and China retaliated.
This is seen as a reasonable step back, hoping to rebuild a more constructive dialogue space. China is also considered ready to separately discuss the fentanyl issue, one of the sensitive contents that led the U.S. to. In fact, Beijing proactively proposed negotiations from the start, right after the U.S. announced plans to impose tariffs related to allegations of illegal fentanyl precursor. The upcoming trade meeting between the two countries is being held near the WTO headquarters in Switzerland. This location is highly symbolic, in the context of the WTO having repeatedly spoken out against U.S. The organization warns that dividing the global economy into confronting blocs could cause world GDP to drop by nearly 7%.
In the long term, severely impacting poor and developing countries.
For the U.S., the prospect of completely losing trade relations with China has caused many difficulties, especially for consumers, who are accustomed to cheap goods. Supply shortages could push commodity prices higher, making inflation harder to control. In reality, the U.S. retail sector has begun to clearly feel this impact as import cargo volumes are forked for the first time since the 2023 supply chain crisis. Nevertheless, the U.S. administration continues to pursue bilateral trade agreements. A recent agreement with the U.K. has been praised as evidence of the effectiveness of a strategy of applying pressure through tariffs, while also arguing that the U.S. can use tariffs as a tool to push other countries to make concessions in trade negotiations. If U.S.-China tensions continue to escalate, Vietnam, with its highly open economy, will face a duel. In the short term, some sectors such as electronics and textiles may benefit from FDI flows moving away from China. However, in the long term, weak global demand and dependence on supply chains linked to China will pose significant challenges. In this context, Vietnam's proactive promotion of tariff negotiations with the U.S. is aimed at expanding cooperation, minimizing risks, and stabilizing.
Like the journey? Subscribe and join the next expedition.